he was very energetic, he was very determined, just full of sort of get up and go.
If you look at the self-portrait he did, you can see that he is looking even at himself with that very wide-eyed way that small children do. They look at the world constantly with a sense of amazement and, good heavens, what's that we don't as adults. I think he went through his entire life looking in that kind of a way.
So Piazzi Smyth had a lot of talents, and he did a lot of different things. He was a good practical working astronomer. He understood instrumentation. He was a little bit of an engineer, designed new types of instrument. He worked in meteorology, how the weather worked and trying to predict the weather. He was an archaeologist. He was a very good artist. Everywhere he went, he took his sketchbook and drew pictures. He was a pioneer in photography. He took stereo photographs, which were just amazing at the time.
Charles Piazzi Smyth was born in Italy in 1819. The family subsequently moved back to England, and at the time that he finished his schooling at the age of 16, his father took a hand and assisted him to get a job as assistant astronomer at the Cape of Good Hope. In the meantime, the first Astronomer Royal in Scotland, a man by the name of Thomas Henderson, was busy on Carlton Hill making stellar atlases, but Henderson died suddenly in 1844, leaving this post vacant. Piazzi Smyth's father again encouraged him to apply for this job, and he was the successful candidate, coming to Carlton Hill in early 1846 to take up his post. There is an obvious question that crops up when a new Astronomer Royal arrives at the Royal Observatory, and that is, what is this Astronomer Royal going to do? And one of the first things he did was to look at the time service. When ships docked in the port of Leith, the mariners would have to bring their chronometers up onto the hill, correct their chronometer as a result of the master clock in the observatory, and then take the chronometer back to the ship. Now, not only was this a pain in the neck to do, but also it ran the risk that they jolted the clock en route back to the ship, and it may not be reading the correct time. So Piazzi Smyth decided that he would give both a visual and an audible warning of what the time was, so that the mariners could stay on their ships, correct the time on their clocks on the ship, and therefore know that they hadn't jolted their clock prior to actually sailing. The time ball he erected in 1852 on top of the Nelson Monument was wound up manually between 10 to 1 and 1 o'clock, so the mariners know that 1 o'clock is approaching, and then at 1 o'clock it is dropped automatically by an electrical signal from the master clock in the observatory, transmitted to the ball by a wire in the ground between the two buildings. Now, this is all very well, but on wet days the mariners cannot see the time ball on the Nelson Monument. Hence why in 1861 Charles Piazzi Smyth added the time gun to the repertoire. Now they can hear the message if indeed they can't see it. And as a legacy to Charles Piazzi Smyth, in Edinburgh we still drop that time ball to this day, and we still fire the time gun.
His wife Jessie was extremely important to him in several ways. Emotionally, they were a very close couple, they went everywhere together, but she was his scientific partner as well.
She was a geologist, and she was also tireless, she was also immensely energetic, and the two of them obviously worked well together. So I imagine that much of what he could do and did do, she could do, and that they informed each other's work in a thoroughly effective way. A good marriage, a partnership.
You know, his work would have been impossible without her. She knew much more geology than he did, but she became a good practicing astronomer as well. So they went on all the expeditions together. and she helped to organise it, and she set up the instruments and they made the measurements together. And they really worked as a team. He was incredibly young. He was 16 years old and he went to work in South Africa. And as part of his duties there, he was doing surveying work, working for the observatory, but he was surveying. And this took him to a lot of distant places, including up the top of mountains. And when he was watching the sky from those mountains, it struck him that the stars were much steadier and sharper. And that stayed with him the rest of his life. So when he took up the job in Edinburgh, he was already determined to explore the idea that astronomy should be done not from smoky cities like Edinburgh, but from mountaintops. So he looked around for a sensible place to go and test this idea. And he settled on the Canaries, and in particular Tenerife. So he raised the money with his funders, and he set off to Tenerife with his wife. The trip to Tenerife historically is very, very important in the whole development of astronomy, because he was correct that astronomy should be done from mountaintops. Today, of course, even better, we go into space, but the top of mountains is the right place to do this. Piazzi Smyth and his wife and his team of helpers that he gathered along the way, while they were on Tenerife, they did a lot of very interesting experiments, geology and botany as well as astronomy. But the three key things that made a difference to astronomy in the future are as follows. He measured double stars, he measured the solar spectrum, and he measured infrared radiation from the moon. They were all very important. If you take double stars at a variety of separations, as he looked at closer and closer stars, when he made measurements from Edinburgh or even from sea level in Tenerife, close together stars would just be a kind of fat blob. You couldn't tell there were two stars, and the images wobbled about with time, snaked about. When he went up the mountain, those same stars, you could see clearly there were two separate stars, but also the images were stable, they were steady, so you could actually see what was going on. So we could see the legacy of Piazzi Smyth's expedition to Tenerife today, both in Edinburgh and in the Canaries. So Edinburgh now is a very successful observatory, and the technical aspects of what he's done has been implemented. But in the Canaries, it's now a world-famous, extremely successful observatory. It's one of just a handful of places in the world that are recognised as the best places to do astronomy. There are observatories all over the world, including in all the best observing sites, including Tenerife and La Palma and Hawaii and Chile. And astronomers do the travelling, just like he thought, but they don't take the telescopes with them. The telescopes are waiting there for them. We are all now peripatetic astronomers. We move around the world and go to the best places to make the measurements we need to make. And that became a reality for Edinburgh very late on, 100 years after his trip. It finally became real when the UK started setting up observatories in Australia, in the Canaries and in Hawaii, and we've not looked back since. So that's his legacy, that's those observatories.